All right, good morning, online family and friends. This is your favorite Sunday school teacher, third vice president, usher board, number 4, New Zion Missionary Baptist Church here in Rockford, Illinois. Thanking God for another beautiful day He's given us just to rejoice and be glad in Him. Recognize that some people who might be watching this or are watching it not live, but later on during the day or maybe even later on in the week. And we would encourage you to, regardless of when you're engaging this Bible lesson, that you would reach out in the comment section, that you would interact with us as we try to teach you from the Word of God. This is African American History Month, and we're looking at I'm calling it the theology of history. Not the history of theology, but the theology of history. What is God's philosophy about history? So come on in the room. If you are joining us live, we're inviting you to reach out in the comment section. Let us know how you're doing today and give us the top 3 things you're most grateful for. I don't know if I gave a shout out. Wait a minute. Maybe that was Wednesday, but was it not last Monday with the SOAR Music Awards? Was that? Yeah, that was Monday. So I want to give a special shout out again to Pastor Justin Francis and his brilliant bride, as well as the SOAR Radio family, the SOAR Music Awards family. Anybody that's got something with SOAR, we want to highlight you and thank you for being a catalyst for excellence here in the city of Rockford, particularly as it relates to gospel music. They sponsored another outstanding music awards. This was the choir edition, and the reason I bring it up is because one of our own, Sister Kimberly Lawson Roby, was honored with a Lifetime Achievement Award. I think I'm getting the award incorrect, but bottom line, she was honored as she should be, and we're grateful to God for all that she has done in her writing, particularly in the last book that she wrote about being all that God intends for you to be. So let's make sure, okay. Technology is coming through clean and clear. Hopefully you can hear me well and see us clearly. And we're just about ready to get going here, because I believe I gave you an assignment for those of you who were with us last week. This is African American History Month, and it's a perfect time for us to recalibrate ourselves to the truth about history. And more importantly, what does the Bible say our interaction should be with history? Now, reason we're studying this lesson is not just because it's African American History Month, but because in our current political and cultural climate in these yet to be United States, the topic of history, let me say it this way. There's some people who don't want the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth. And what I would like to argue, not from a cultural or political perspective, but from a theological perspective, you have to reckon with the good, the bad, and the ugly of all of history. Because when you don't, that is to say, when you don't reflect upon, when you don't analyze, when you don't take the lessons from history, and when you don't view it from a theological perspective, what you're actually doing is robbing God of his glory, because God, now listen to what I'm getting ready to say, because either the Bible is true or it's not. And if the Bible is true, and if God is God, then all things still work together for the good to those who love God and are called to his purpose. And more importantly, all of history, all of time and history, it's finding its culmination in the person and work of the Lord Jesus Christ. We studied that last week. Let me hit it again. Ephesians chapter 1 talks about not only does God do everything after the counsel of his will, but everything will find its culmination. The end goal is Jesus Christ. That includes all the evil of evil men. He factored that in. It's very interesting if you think about it. Now, I'm waiting for you all to check in. I'm just, okay, good. Everybody says the sound and the visuals are all right. So I need everybody to check in. If you're watching this right now, go ahead and type in how you're doing today in a word or a phrase, and then type in the top 3 things that you're most grateful to God for as we get ready to go on this journey as it relates to the God's philosophy as it relates to history. And again, I'm trying to make the argument that God has worked through all of the good, the bad, and the ugly of our personal, our family, our national, and even our ethnic history. And when you try to take parts out, like Thomas Jefferson did with the slave Bible, the Negro Bible, go look it up online. You can purchase one actually on Amazon. You can go to the Bible Museum in Washington, D.C., and you can see the Bible. Now think about how evil this is. Somebody took the Bible, one of our founding fathers, took the Bible, but then took out the parts that he thought would encourage slaves to not be slaves. No, the Jeffersonian Bible. Don't take my word for it. Look it up online. Go buy one off of Amazon. Go make a trip to the Bible Museum and see how people have tried since the founding of this country, because this is what I'm going to start getting at today. Since the founding of this country, people have been trying to use the Bible to justify the oppression of certain groups, the marginalization of certain groups, the so-called superiority of certain groups. And Thomas Jefferson himself, a massive slave owner who violated this teenage girl who had descendants who were categorized as both black and white, and whose so-called black descendants are yet fighting for some of the rights and some of the sort of privileges that the white descendants have enjoyed. That person took the Holy Bible and then took out the parts that talked about man stealing being a sin, and all these various references. Strangely enough, one thing he forgot to take out is that one day there's going to be a judgment day. Wait a minute. He forgot to take that out. He tried to take out all the little references that would not support the narrative that he was trying to promote. He couldn't take out the judgment day piece. He couldn't take out Revelations. Otherwise, your whole Bible don't make no sense. Because one day, and I'd like to say this very clearly and cleanly, one day God going to set everything straight. One day everybody's going to have to stand before the judgment seat of God. And even though justice might seem elusive in our time and day, one day every mountain is going to be brought low, every valley exalted, every crooked place made straight, every rough place made smooth, all the inequities, all the injustices, all of the evil in this world will be dealt with by the judge. See, think about this. The Bible starts with creation. It ends with the consummation of the age. If there's a creator, you're going to be held accountable to him. And if there's a judgment day, you better get ready. Let me get in my lesson. I'm getting ready to preach a whole different sermon. What my lesson say? Okay. Now I gave you, is everybody checked in? Go ahead and check in, children. And again, if you're watching this later, you still supposed to check in. Let us know how you're doing. African American History Month. But let's talk about the fact that God works through history. He has revealed himself through, in, and by history. And all time, because he's the creator, all time has a termination point. He dwells in eternity. God dwells in a high and holy place. He dwells in eternity, also with those who are a contrite spirit. That's what Isaiah says. I believe in Isaiah, is that chapter 54? Let me make sure I got my references right here. I'm sorry, that's Isaiah 57, verse 15. But thus says the high and exalted one who lives forever, whose name is holy. I dwell on a high and a holy place, and also with the contrite and lowly of spirit, in order to revive the spirit of the lowly and to revive the contrite of heart. In other words, God dwells in eternity. He's created us, and we live in time. But one day, he's going to call all of us into account for all that has been done. But in the meantime, he's been working in, and revealing himself by history. Now, I've given you a couple assignments, if I'm not mistaken, last week, for those of you who have been with us, and even if you weren't, I need to make this an assignment today. I asked you to write out your personal testimony, because you need to reflect on your own personal history, because God has been revealing some stuff through your history. And that's why you need to be able to reflect on the good, the bad, and the ugly. Come here, Joseph. They ain't listening to me. Joseph, in Genesis chapter 50, verse 20, after spending several, from our perspective, chapters of the Bible, from his perspective, perhaps over weeks, he had to process the trauma that had happened to him in his younger days. That is to say, as the favored son of his father, his brothers were jealous of him to the extent that they actually were willing to or wanting to put him to death, but instead they enslaved him. And in his enslavement, they sold him to slavers. And in his enslavement, he continued to prosper while he was in the house of Potiphar, prosper even when he was unjustly accused and wound up in prison, and then prospered in the palace. And as he looked back over his personal history, he wept at certain points as he was trying to work through that thing, as he encountered his brothers and was reminded, hey, these are the cats that tried to kill me. But then he found out, wait a minute, I didn't get the whole story. Actually, Reuben was trying to save me. Wait a minute. And my little brother is still alive. As he reckoned with all of that thing and processed all of that thing, here's the bottom line. By the time we get to the end of the book of Genesis, he said, y'all meant it for evil, but God meant it for good. Now, what did he do there? He took his personal history, the good, the bad, and the ugly. He thought through that thing theologically. He said, you know what? It was bad. I'm not going to pretend like it was all good. I went through some stuff. And y'all are responsible for it. Because I didn't do nothing to you, but because of your choices, I had to suffer. But when you get done talking, y'all meant it a certain way, but you didn't understand that God meant it for something else. Let me say something to you about your personal history. That's why I want you to write out your testimony. Doesn't matter if your parents thought you were an accident or if they planned you. Doesn't matter if you have both your parents or if you were abandoned and adopted. It doesn't matter if your family was like the Huxtables or your family was like the actual Bill Cosby and there was some malfeasance and there was some violation going on. When you get done talking, if you're watching this, it means that you have survived. And it also means that if they meant it for evil, that's all right. God get the last. Y'all ain't saying nothing. Type in God get the last word. See, it doesn't matter what other people designed or planned. God has a purpose and a plan for your life. And they could have meant it to take you out, but God meant it to lift you up. So you don't have to have, wait a minute, you don't have to have a breakdown. You can have a breakthrough if you understand that, yes, all things actually do work together for those who love God, to those who are called according to his purpose. You mean even the bad stuff? Yeah, even the bad stuff. You mean even this sin that somebody committed against me and I had to suffer? Yeah, even that. That all of that, because God is so, see, you gotta, your God, you gotta get a bigger vision of God. That is to say, you gotta see God for how big he actually is. And God is so big that he can take the evil intentions of evil men and still bring good out of that. If that's not true, then apparently you cutting up your Bible. Because last time I checked, one Friday, evil men with their evil intentions tried to take out the Lord of glory. But God used that same event. That's why we call it Good Friday right now. Wasn't good back then. Wasn't good while he was bleeding and suffering and they were put a crown of thorns on his head and were spitting. That wasn't good. But when you look back at it, I'm talking about with theological eyes. Now you say, wait, okay, now I see. But he was wounded for my transgressions. He was bruised for my iniquities. The chastisement of my peace was upon him. And by his stripes, by how they were whipping him, that's how I got healed. So God, when you get done talking, God is still good. Listen, your personal history. I told you to write out your personal testimony. And I told you about your family history. You got to look back at your family history. Now, I need you to share this with somebody who's struggling right now, that you got to process the good, the bad, and the ugly of your family history. So I gave you an assignment to try to, if you got some old folk yet in the family, if y'all, matter of fact, plan a family reunion. Get your genealogy together. Put it down on paper, or you ain't got to put it on paper, put it in the computer. They actually have, I'm pretty sure they have apps. If they haven't, what do y'all need to create? I'm 99% sure there's probably some kind of app that you can find. I'm not talking about ancestry.com. Now, if you want to do that, that's fine. But I'm saying your own personal history, your own family history, you need to map it out. Who's who? That's why the old folk, they had it right back in the day. You can just bring somebody to that and say, who's your people? Now, why were they doing that? They were doing that for two reasons. Number one, make sure you ain't falling in love with your cousin. Now, who's your people? So, they said, now where they from? Oh, they from such. Hold on. Now, wait a minute. Let's get this thing straight. Now, you talking about the Scootaboo family from Sugarfoot, Mississippi? Yeah. Wait a minute now. Y'all might be our cousins, and then you gotta work that thing out. They're doing it for that reason. And then they were also doing it because they know certain families have certain characteristics. I ain't even got in my lesson good, and I feel the spirit. Listen, certain families got certain characteristics. And so they said, well, this such a family. Said, or even you didn't even have to be dating. You could just have a friend. So, well, Mama, I want to go over to so-and-so. So who are their people? They got to meet. Old school parents, they had to meet the family. They had to meet the people. They ain't just going to let you go and be influenced by a family system that was not healthy or conducive to your well-being. And so before you could go over there, you definitely ain't going over no sleepover, nothing like that. So, well, I want the team, we're going over, my classmates, such and such. Well, who are they people? Where they at? Give me their phone number. Let's talk to them and this and that and other. Let's meet, all that kind of stuff. You see? Because family matters. And family influences matter. So they would ask, particularly, definitely, you're talking about getting married. Who's your people? Where are they from? What they like? All that kind of stuff. Because what were they trying to do? Literally, what they were trying to do back before this was actually a word, they were trying to do a background check. Listen, I'm going to be talking about marriage today in the sermon, because I'm in a little series, stuff we don't talk about at church. I'm going to talk about marriage. And one of the things I'm getting at as it relates to personal history as well as family history in relationship to friendships and as it relates to dating relationships in particular. you need to do a background check. You need to get background check. You don't just, I know you got your little app, but the app don't get enough background. You can fool the little app, you just a swiping. I'm a Tinder match. But what about eHarp? No, listen, you need a background check. Somebody type in background check. You need to go old school. Who's your people? Matter of fact, I got a thing. I'll send it to you if you want it. I got a little thing that I give to people who say, well, we talking about getting, we won't get married. No, wait a minute, here. Answer these 101 questions before y'all even go any further, type of thing. Who are your people? Where are they from? What you like? What your criminal, what do you call it? Criminal record? What's the history of your mental illness and all that kind of stuff? Any history of mental illness in your family? Now, that don't mean you're asking questions to get information so that you'll be informed. I'm not saying that if somebody has, a criminal record that, you automatically, what the children do now? Pop the balloon. Y'all seen this? There's a little show. I'm going to talk about it today where they have people, they have like, say, if it's the female version, they might have 10 guys lined up and each of them got a balloon. And then the girl will come out and they'll start asking questions. And if the guy doesn't think that, he's interested in her, then he'll just pop the balloon type of thing. Talk to some young people if you don't know what I'm talking about. Or there's 20v1, all that kind of old stuff. That's what we're doing nowadays. But listen, you can't just go off of a vibe, children. You need to get information. And what I'm saying is just because somebody has something in their background, that does not necessarily mean you shouldn't deal with them, but you need to be informed that that's what's happening. What happened to your last girlfriend? What happened with your last boyfriend? Now, if they choked the last one and that's what they went to jail for, well, now we got now we got to pump the brakes. You see what I'm saying? But now, if you just when you were a young person, you got caught up in something, running with the wrong crowd, and then you turn your life around, and ever since then you've been mentoring young people, or maybe you do have a history of mental illness in your family, but you stay on your medication and you on therapy and this, that, and that. Okay, well now, you see what I mean? Now I know what I'm dealing with. And maybe we can still talk. I ain't just gonna pop my balloon, because guess what? All of us got a history. That's what I'm trying to say. You got a history too. And just because yours ain't out in the open and they didn't catch you, doesn't mean that you ain't got a personal history. All I'm trying to say, children, is personal history matters. Write out your testimony. That was the assignment from last week. Family history matters. Get your genealogy. Write it all out. You need to do that anyway, just for health reasons, because like in my family, I told you last week, if I know that I got 5 cousins that have died from lymphoma, it doesn't matter that I feel good and I'm feel healthy or whatever. Not every year for my annual checkup, look, check for this. Matter of fact, they even do that. That's why they ask you all those questions at the doctor's office. What's your family history? Did your mama have heart problems? Did your daddy have this? And you just be, why I gotta fill all this? You better fill all of that out, because if certain stuff run in your family, you're more likely to get that, and you gotta be careful about that. Not just in the physical, even in the spiritual. If you know that addiction runs in your family, well, you don't need to be playing around. You know it runs in your family. You see what I'm saying? And so, and some of it gets reinforced in the family. If you know there's a whole bunch of alcoholics in the family, and every time y'all get together for a family event, here come everybody bringing out whatever it is, bring them out their own bottle. Then you have to recognize, okay, this runs in my family. We've made it a part of the culture in my family, but I don't want to pass this part of our DNA down to the next generation. So I'm going to recalibrate. I'm going to make sure that I don't get caught up in what the family do. I can't drink alcohol like y'all. So if y'all going to drink alcohol, don't call me over there. But now, tell you what, instead of drinking all that alcohol, did you know they got a new Uno? What is it? Uno Unchained? Whatever it is. We're going to play these games. We're going to have fun without getting high. and without having stinking breath and a hangover when we get done. Ain't nobody saying that. I'm trying to help you with your family. But you got to get a handle on the family history. And then to treat it like a good piece of buffalo fish. Take the meat and leave the bone alone. If you got a good tradition of prayer in your family, you got a good tradition that, hey, every Sunday we get together and we have a meal together. That's a good tradition. That's a good something to hang on to. Because even people who don't go to church will come to a meal, and then you can tell them what was happening at church. And you can keep the family together. You can try to inculcate something in the next generation. If you got a family history of starting businesses, why don't y'all pool your little resources together? Because children eggs cost $16.89. You better figure out something. By the time your president get done with putting a tariff on this, a tariff on that, we gonna conquer this land and do that and other. You gonna look up and you gonna be living off of beans and rice. You better figure out how to get the family together and say, look, you good with computers, you good with this. Let's figure out how we gonna put this little family business together. All right, let's try to get one more lick in. So that's just been personal history. That's just been family history. And from a biblical perspective, let me remind you, I gave you examples like with Joseph in terms of personal history. In terms of family history, I gave you scriptures last week and pointed out to you that Genesis chapter 12 through 50 really ain't nothing but the history of the family of Abram and how things worked out and how God was working through that family. God can work through Abraham after he lied about his wife, pimped his wife, slept with the Hagar, had another baby. And he can do all of them. He can work through your family too. Now let's talk about, here we go. Let's talk about national history. This is where I need you to pray for me that God would keep my mind clear as these yet to be United States have all of these forces, and I'll be quite blunt with you, forces in the so-called, in a certain camp, that is, not all, but there's a certain strain of white evangelical Christianity that is hung up on this thing of not teaching things that will make white children feel uncomfortable, or framing the actual articulation of the facts as indoctrination or propaganda. No, propaganda is when you try to make it seem like the people who were storming the Capitol on January the 6th were patriots. We were watching, not on CNN, MSNBC, or Fox. We were watching on Instagram and Twitter as they were streaming themselves, committing crimes, chanting about killing Mike Pence, and at the same time having crosses and nooses in the same event. So we saw with our own eyes, and we're seeing even now as President Trump has pardoned everybody that was participating in that, including the people that were actually causing bodily harm to policemen. We're seeing people trying to revise history as we speak, because that's what has happened in our nation. Now, let me say something here. If our nation is going to, let me just say it this way. If our nation is going to be all that God wants it to be, I will even go so far as to say, if our nation is going to survive, we're going to have to reckon with history. And every time, it's very interesting that even as relates to our educational system, there are moves in certain states and certain places where you can have AP history and Asian history and this history and that history. There are places where people don't want to have AP African American history. They've tried to write certain things out of our history. And let me be more blunt. It seems that every time there's an inflection point, so when I say inflection point, an event, whether it be Trayvon Martin, whether it be Michael Brown, whether it be Sandra Massey, whether it be George Floyd during the pandemic, where people could not avoid seeing and watching what had happened to him. Seems whenever we have an inflection point, there's a move to sort of get a grip on history, but then there's a tremendous backlash, a tremendous wave, where people try to come up with some kind of boogeyman to justify not actually reconciling with history. When I say boogeyman, what I mean by that is, for example, back during the Obama era, the boogeyman was cultural Marxism. If you talked about anything related to African-American progress or African-American history, oh, what that really is Marxism. Oh, you all are cultural Marxists. Right? And then it became, here after George Floyd, the big push was, now remember, after George Floyd and that video came out and after that whole thing, people all over the world, not just the United States, people all over the world were marching out in protest. And if you were paying attention, it wasn't just black people. Even the marches here in Rockford. I remember very distinctly, I forgot the chief before Carlo read, but I remember whatever that chief's name. I remember him calling me. O'Shea, during the protests, because certain things were going on, and hey, pastor, trying to get advice, this, that, and other. But if you were paying attention to the marches, even right here in Rockford, there were way more white people marching than there were black people. It wasn't a black or white thing. It was a right and wrong thing. And people were saying it's wrong for somebody to kneel on somebody else's neck for over 8 minutes with their hand in their pocket. Ain't black or white? It's right or wrong. And so white people were up in arms until there was a big backlash. They said, well, no, that's really about this whole CRT, critical race theory. And that's what that is. So people who are arguing that we shouldn't be able to choke people to death, what it really is, it ain't cultural Marxism now. It's CRT. And you can't even spell CRT, don't even know what it means. But that's the boogeyman. I'm talking about, I've had actual debates with people about this. I wrote an article, and let me be even more blunt. I wrote an article during that time because I can't remember the gentleman's name right now, but you remember up here in Wisconsin where Kyle Rittenhouse had shot and killed those people. Now a young person from Illinois, underage, his mama then drove him up there. He got a rifle that he ain't supposed to have, and he done shot and killed people, and then he walked past the police, went on back to the house. I wrote something, not about him, but about the man who also, and I forgot his name that quick, there was another man up in Wisconsin around that same area who the police, there was some kind of dispute at a birthday party for his children, and he was either taking one of the kids, putting them in the car or whatever, and the policeman shot him 7 or 8 times, but he survived. And, there's a big hubbub about that. So a Christian organization asked me to write an article about what it feels like to be a black person in these times and days where you have, all these types of events going on. So I wrote the little article, and then the editor said, well, since this shooting of this black man 7 or 8 times, he was unarmed at the time, but later on they found out that he was probably either reaching for a knife or the officer thought he was reaching for a gun, but at the time he was unarmed and the officer didn't know what he was reaching for. And so they shot him, but he miraculously survived. The editor said, look, it's very rare that events like what Kyle Rittenhouse did and what this other guy, whatever happened to this other man, that it's very rare that they happen sort of in the same jurisdiction. Why don't you add something? Why don't you point that out? I said, well, the article, you asked me to just write about what it feels like to be a black man in these things. They said, yeah, but just, can you put something in there about that? So I put one line in there about how is it possible that people are more afraid of an unarmed black man that they think might have something, as opposed to white men. You remember, I forgot this other guy's name that went in and shot up all the black people at a prayer meeting. They invited him in and he went, shot them up, killed them dead. But they got him alive. And my argument was, how is it that every time some black person is shot multiple times, usually in the back, unarmed, because they think he might have something, but white people who actually have shot somebody and got the gun in their hands can come away alive? That was the only point of the argument, but I fooled around and actually said something, or put in a parentheses something about Kyle Rittenhouse, and people went crazy. I got death threats in my emails. I got all kind of ugly emails. I was afraid to open up emails for a while from people who called themselves Christians, because the boogeyman at that time. And then a scholar whose name I won't mention wrote an article in response to my article saying that really what I was trying to promote was CRT. Now, here's the irony of the thing. Critical race theory is actual legal sort of theory that came about a few decades ago, that is sometimes taught in law school. In law school, ain't nobody in elementary school teaching nothing about CRT. Nobody know nothing about that's a legal thing. But he was saying, oh, what he's really trying to do is CRT and blah, 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 blah. I'm like, wow. So now the boogeyman is CRT. Guess what the boogeyman is today? DEI. Diversity, equity, and inclusion. All great words, but that's the boogeyman. That's what we got to get out. And so now we have a president that has made it his mission. We're getting rid of all evidence, all whatever, because that's propaganda. No, here's what it is. If you study the history of these yet to be United States, listen to what I'm saying. This is why history matters. This is why the people of God need to not only pay attention to personal history, to family history, but to national history. Every time this country tries to reckon with the fact that it was so-called founded on liberty, with most of its inhabitants either massacred through genocide, I'm talking about the Native Americans, or enslaved people, because we don't want to reconcile with that, we allow people to come up with new boogeymans every decade to keep us from dealing with the truth. And the bottom line is that slavery and all its Hydra-like evolutions are not ancient history, but unfortunately they're unknown history to most Americans. People still think, well, we can free the slaves. What y'all complaining about? Get over it. Wait a minute. Number one, I'm 62 years old. My father just died in 2023 in September. My great-grandfather died in 1962, the year I was born. He was born in 1852. My daddy used to spend summers with his grandfather, my great-grandfather, used to spend summers with him all the time. And my great-grandfather would tell my father what it was like growing up enslaved. So in other words, me, this fella you looking at, used to eat regularly with somebody who used to eat regularly that was born in slavery. It ain't ancient history. This is what I just said. My daddy, who I used to eat regularly with, he used to eat regularly with somebody who was born enslaved. My great-grandfather was born in 1852. Slavery ain't ancient history, but here's the problem. You can get a so-called world-class education and rise up to the greatest ranks of politics, academia, and even theology, and not know a lick about African-American history, except something about Rosa Parks didn't get up and King was a real good speaker and Lincoln freed the slaves. And I'd like to say something, particularly if I have any white friends that are watching this. You need to learn African American history, because you don't know American history if you don't know African American history. The Constitution doesn't even make any sense unless you know African American history. Right now, what's the big debate about as it relates to birthright citizenship? That's the 14th Amendment. Why do we have a 14th Amendment? The 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendment were put into the Constitution to at least try to start reckoning with the fact that we used to enslave a significant portion of the people in this country, and now they're free. And how are we going to reconcile? What are we going to do with that? You see? So if you don't know anything about Juneteenth or the Tulsa Black Wall Street, we have one of, I was getting tied up right there because we have one of the former members here, the church, right now down in Tulsa, dealing with some of the aftermath of that. Have you never heard of Rosewood or the Red Summer of 1919, when in the midst of a worldwide pandemic, some white supremacists incited riots across the country? See, if you don't know that history, then stuff that's happening right now don't make sense. But if you can reckon with the history and the whole history, then you'll understand that really America is actually a miracle, that we're still here. It's just been the very few people, by God's grace, who have been praying. Open up your Bible. Let's see something here in a couple of passages. Psalm 78 and then Psalm 89, and then I'm going to try to bring this to a close. I don't want to keep you too long today. Get a chance, come on out to New Zion. We're going to be talking about marriage. But in Psalm 78, we read this before, and I just want to point it out. The whole chapter, the whole Psalm 78, 72 verses, it really details the history of the Israelites from the time of Moses up to the time of David. But he says something very interesting in verse 3 through 7. I'm just going to read it and then we're going to move off of it. The psalmist says, listen, we will, in verse 3, the things which we have heard and known our fathers have told us, and we will not conceal them from their children, but tell to the generation to come the praises of the Lord and his strength and his wondrous works which he has done. We established a testimony in Jacob and appointed a law in Israel, which he commanded our fathers, that they should teach them to their children, that the generation to come might know, even the children yet to be born, that they may arise and tell them to their children, that they should put their confidence in God and not forget the works of God, but keep his commandments and not be like their fathers, a stubborn and rebellious generation, a generation that did not prepare its heart and whose spirit was not faithful to God. Now, if you keep on reading, which I'm not going to do, you'll see how he'll detail the history of the people of Israel and how it was cyclical, just like American history is. You remember I talked about, like, whenever there's an inflection point, there's an effort to move forward, and then there's a backlash. The same was happening with Israel. For example, if you still have your Bible open to Psalm 78, verse 10 and 11 says, they did not keep the covenant of God and refused to walk in his law. They forgot his deeds and his miracles, which he had shown them. He wrought wonders before their fathers in the land of Egypt. And so he talks about how God did all these great things, got them out of Egypt, helped them to get through the wilderness and fed them in the wilderness. But look at verse 32. I'm still in Psalm 78. I'm just trying to make a point about why you need to know your nation's history. Verse 32 says, in spite of all of this, they still sinned and not believe in his wonderful works. He brought their days to an end in futility and their years to a sudden terror. When he killed them, then they sought him and returned and searched diligently for God. And they remembered that God was their rock and the Most High, their Redeemer. In other words, if you keep on reading, and I'm going to read one more passage just to make my point, and then we'll get off of this. Keep on reading in verse 40, 41, and 42, Psalm 78 says, they often rebelled against him in the wilderness and grieved him in the desert. Again and again they tempted God and pained the Holy One of Israel. They did not remember his power the day that he redeemed them from the adversary. What kept happening with Israel is what keeps happening to us. And that is, they forget and then they remember. They forget and then they remember. And you don't, at some point we need to break the cycle and remember what has happened in history. And remember that these efforts at Christian nationalism didn't start in 2024 or with the writing of that this little thing called Project 2025. This effort. Now, President Trump has appointed Paula White as over the office of, I forgot, the Office of Religious Affairs. I might have that wrong. And now she's supposed to be rooting out all of the anti-Christian bias in so-called federal agencies. That's not the first time this thing has been tried. It's not going to work, and it's not biblical. Simply because the type of Christianity that President Trump is trying to promote, the type of Christianity where you can sell a Bible for $59.99 so you can pay off the debt that you have for your court cases, and you put in the Bible the American Constitution. That kind of Christianity ain't the Christianity of the risen Christ. And Paula White is the same one who, instead of praying that whoever gets in office has wisdom and discernment and leads with peace, she's the same one, if you remember, was calling African angels to come and make sure that Trump won back when he lost. That's who's over the Office of Religious Affairs, to root out anti-Christian bias. Children, if we ever needed to study history and learn the lessons from history, we need it now, because this so-called Christianity that a certain group of politicians and even white nationalists are promoting is the rebranding of that Christianity that Frederick Douglass decried. And you can read his speech about that, where Frederick Douglass talked about the difference between this slave-owning, back-whipping, mother-raping Christianity and the Christianity of the Bible. The gulf between that is so big that it cannot be bridged. And the Christianity of people who will storm a Capitol, have nooses along with the cross, and will support somebody standing up talking about, oh, that ain't the Nazi sign. Come on, bro. Come on. We've seen all this before. We know what happens next. So be mindful during African American History Month. If you're not African American, you need to know African American history, because you can't understand American history without pulling into and fully embracing the history of the most marginalized people. And when I say most marginalized people, I'm not just saying African Americans, I'm saying even Native Americans, and that whole genocide piece as it relates to them, and how we wiped out a whole sort of whole nations of people who are living here peacefully, not just with disease, but by violence. And then the enslavement of African Americans, and at first this whole indentured servitude, where certain Europeans were not white at that time, and how the Irish and the Italians and certain other groups were treated. But my point today is simply this: that God is concerned about national history, and that's why the Bible, whether you look at Psalm 78, I didn't get to it because I want to close up on time. as well as Psalm 89. If you would just look at the Psalms, you will see the recording of the history of the people of Israel and what God says why they need to remember their history, lest they repeat the foolishness of their fathers. That's the theological point. And when you think about the fact that the first 5 books of the Bible are the history primarily of a family and a nation, and then the rest of the New Testament shows the inflection points of that nation and how they rebelled against God and the consequences of that rebellion, but how God, even through that negative history, was bringing one who would come and set all the nations. Listen, why do the nations rage? Why do the Gentiles? Why are they filled with rage? This is Psalm 2. Don't they know that God is laughing and that he's working through national history, and that one day every nation, every tribe, every tongue is going to have to bow before the one who's the ruler of every nation. Now, this is on top of all of that. It's vitally important in these days where basically it seems like the playbook is to do something crazy every day so you don't remember the craziness that happened yesterday. Keep your eyes on the prize. I'm talking to Christians. I'm not just talking about African American Christians. I'm talking about Christians. Pay attention, because this authoritarian impulse that is running rampant here in the United States, it's not just in the United States, it's across the globe. If you really pay attention to global dynamics, authoritarians are on the rise everywhere. But here in these, yet to be United States, we need to make sure that we're paying close attention to the present and remembering the lessons of the past, lest we find ourselves in another McCarthy era where people are being persecuted off of innuendo. We find ourselves in another J. Edgar Hoover era where the FBI is weaponized, COINTELPRO. Look at your history. All the stuff that President Trump is talking about doing right now, we've already seen that under J. Edgar Hoover and this COINTELPRO piece, and how they tried to make Martin Luther King commit suicide and planted evidence on people and had moles and all these types of things and tried. It's not myth. The actual FBI director before the one that is now, I think his name is Bob Ray, he talks about how he has had in his office the actual documents of COINTELPRO, the government-backed effort to disrupt the civil rights movement, to denigrate its leaders, and to actually sort of cut off assistance to HBCUs so that no other black leaders would rise up. That's in legal documents. The former FBI director used to have it on his wall so he would be reminded never to go down that path. He was smart enough to say, look, I know what our history is, and I need to guard against that history. What I'm saying to you as a Christian, if you're a Christian, pay a close attention to our nation's. Do your own research. Get information and find out that this whole issue of racism is more than just about color. It's about power. That's why I recommend Isabel Wilkerson's book. She won a Pulitzer Prize for her first book, The Warmth of Other Sermons. I think this one is even better, where she talks about caste, and she looks at it from a global perspective of how evil people, whether in India or whether in Germany, will use certain arbitrary types of things to create a hierarchy of human value, which is completely anti-Christian and anti-God. And how, even this is very interesting if you read the book, how in the history of America, the German people came over here to study how we were doing racism so that they could set up their system. And some of the American pieces of racism, like if you have one drop of black blood, then, all the complicated ways American history would try to denigrate the African impulse. The Nazis said, wait a minute, y'all going too far. We ain't going to do all of that. That's bad when a Nazi say you're going too far. Read it in your book. in the book, South Africa and all what happened over there. You can read and see so you can get a perspective that, man, if we really look at history, then we ought to really be more concerned about what's going on right now because we've seen it before. And we need to remember what happens when godly people don't stand up to evil men. And if I can say this as I close, and as we look at history, we'll come to realize that even though in one sense America tries to make everything black and white, it's really about right and wrong, because there were white people who were against slavery from the beginning. I'm talking about white Christians, Quakers, and men of the brethren never were down for slavery. And they were white. When you talk about the abolitionists who worked with Frederick Douglass, who were white. It's never been about black and white. It's about right and wrong. And if you're a Christian, then you recognize that you need to be like Barbara Henry. That's the woman who came from Boston and taught Ruby Bridges while other white parents were taking their children out of the school system. She came and taught her and treated her like she was her own daughter. So which side of history you going to be on? That's what I'm trying to say. I would admonish you to study history, because biblically speaking, God does not want us to forget the foolishness of our fathers, lest we make the same type of mistakes. Now, next week, I'm going to pick up and talk about the African presence in the Bible. Because if you're not careful and if you listen to and I've been doing some research about this, even as it relates to Christian schools, and how are Christian schools, particularly homeschool, how are they teaching African American history? And I'll share some shocking findings next week. And I've met with a tremendous young lady who is a researcher at the University of Chicago, who was sort of instructing me on some things about the aesthetics of art and how some people are trying to use the concept of beauty to try to denigrate and discount the African and the African American influence. And I'll share a little bit more about that next week as well. So I want you to do some homework. If you haven't written out your personal testimony, I need you to do that. Secondly, and if you have done that, you say, I did write out my personal testimony. Well, why don't you consider writing your own memoir? You don't have to publish it unless you want to, but you need to write it out, because there's something that happens when we write things out that we're able to process things. Your own personal history, get your family tree, your genealogy laid out. Y'all, if you need to pull together a little cousins meeting, a little mini family reunion, do that. Get all that written out. But then I want you to do some research on African American history. Now, I want to recommend Isabel Wilkerson, because both of her books, and you can get them on audio books, both of her books, The Warmth of Other Suns and Cast, do a magnificent job of sort of giving the broad reach of and the implications of our history. But you can get the 1619 Project, you can get all manner of things that are readily readable and easy to digest. But next week, I'm going to start with the African presence in the Bible, because if you're not careful, when you pay attention to what our so-called history books here in the United States do, you might think our history started with slavery, when in point of fact, there were civilizations on the African continent that were doing things we still haven't been able to figure out. Isn't it strange? Comics talk about this. But isn't it strange when it comes to things like African history, when it comes to things like the pyramids, people say, well, it must have been aliens came down here and did it. It couldn't be the Africans that did it. And nobody say that about all these other wonders of the world around other places across the world. But we'll pick up on that next week. That's enough. I want to end on time. I hope you've been blessed. I hope you got your assignments, and I hope you pay attention. Don't disconnect yourself. I know there's craziness happening every day, and it can be overwhelming. But pay attention, children. to your history and what's going on right now, lest we fall into the same traps that some of our fathers fell into. God bless you and have a great day.